then of course we can't deny the political pressure of simply nobody wants to get left behind. There's the whole FOMO thing. And so everyone is having to do something. And so there was an article in CIO that you found that is talking about Avery Dennison's culture first approach to AI transformation. And I'm really curious what your take was, or why you pulled this, because I actually saw it and honestly I glanced right over it. And I take these kind of case study articles with a huge grain of salt, mostly because I spent most of my career on the other side and I know the truth behind the mirage in many cases. Um, but when I read through this, and I've actually, in disclosure, it's been 15 years, but I did a lot of work with Avery Dennison back in the day.
Mhm.
They were a different company, really, in some different businesses at the time. But in either case, um, what I find really interesting is that the CIO took two big things, two distinct approaches here. The first, the culture first moniker really basically means focused on the organizational change dynamics, meaning trying to shift the perspective of how employees are leveraging AI
Mhm.
to create opportunities for productivity and advantage and whatever. And the second big characteristic of what Avery did here was they sort of went to a craps table and placed bets on everything. Right. So this was, I think they said they launched what was it, something like 1,000? No, how many was it? 20 projects
Mhm.
across 1,000 employees. Right. So do the math. That's not, so basically they made a bunch of small bets to sort of see what was going to work. But these weren't experimentation in the way that a lot of companies have. They actually put this stuff into production. And I thought that was actually really interesting that they sort of just really dove in, but they spread this across a very wide playing field. Um, and and the results seem to be showing positively, although that's the part I sort of take a skeptical grain of salt with. But I mean, what was your take? I mean, why did you happen? Why did you do what I do and just skip right over this one?
So one of the things that got my attention, it was the structured approach to an enterprise-wide AI deployment, which is relatively rare to see right now. The idea that you would actually get 20,000 employees on board with using AI, in this case, Google Gemini, as a primary tool. That got my attention. And then the idea that they were bought into the amount of savings that uh, happened as a result. So they talk about 10 hours a month, which is 2.5 hours a week. So I'm just going to call it 2 hours a week. So that's 5% of your work week. And that is basically the practical savings that they saw. One of the things that was missing from this case study that I would be really interested in is how they reallocated that time, because that's always the key to saving time.
Mm-hmm.
If you
Right.
talk about saving 2 hours in 6 second increments and you can't actually reuse those 6 seconds for anything else, you're just kind of making up time savings. It's not actually time saved. But if you can actually take an hour or two uh, in actual chunks and reuse that to work on some other project, or maybe even give some people half days so they can go watch their kid's soccer game or whatever, that's far more valuable from either a work-life balance perspective or a productivity perspective. And that's one of the things that I think gets left out of time saved at the end of. But be that as it may, they're talking about saving 200,000 hours a month in overall, and that that's a bigger accomplishment or value proposition than you're seeing from most AI projects in the here and now.
Yeah, and I don't want to shoot myself in the foot, right? One of the things that Symphony does is we go to market with the story that this is the kind of productivity savings, and one
Mhm.
of the things that we hear back is, well, how do you measure that? And
Mhm.
the difficult part is it's an incredibly difficult thing to measure, and it's almost always self-reported. I mean, unless you have gone Big Brother and fully instrumented your employees, where you're monitoring everything they're doing, it's
Yes.
very hard to get quantitative data. And so the reality is this: I don't want to say take it with a grain of salt. I mean, we this is it's really interesting. This is the number, or pretty dang close to the number that we talk about, 3 hours a week that you can save by taking these approaches. And so it's interesting. It really lines up pretty closely to what we're talking about and what we're seeing with with our clients. but it is very, very difficult. It's half art, half science, and so I think it's fascinating, and that question of what do they do with that is looms large, because that is what, and I agree with you. Like, I'm perfectly 100% aboard if it is all about the employee experience and we're just making their life less frustrating and therefore they are more energized. um, I don't know that anyone can ever measure it, but I am fully convinced that will make you more competitive in the market. If you have happier employees that are feeling more energized about their job and feel good about the company who invested in them and made their life a little bit better and dealt with some of this crap that was frustrating them, they're going to engage more enthusiastically. And that's going to somehow, some way translate into your bottom line, even if we can't actually draw a straight,
Mhm.
dark line between the two. So I think that's perfectly fine. But to your point, if it's in these little 6 second increments where it doesn't actually feel like it, where they don't sense that they're getting that,
And they're still
then
working 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 or whatever,
then it's not going to change anything. Yeah. And
yeah.
so I think it's an interesting, I think, when you look at all of this, if I look at this in balance, my big takeaway was I agree with you. I appreciate the way Avery approached it. I appreciate the systematic approach on both levels, on spreading the risks out, doing production level experimentation of actually putting stuff in the real world and seeing what happens, trying to take a measure of the value that it created for the company. Didn't What was absent, notably absent in their story, was any talk about replacing employees, right? This wasn't
Mhm.
about an employee reduction side of it. And it was very much so, if we go through this landscape, it was not focused on the entry level jobs. It was focused on the MIT version of it, of augmenting the employees and making them more productive. Um, but then the question remains looming large, going all the way to where we started, is did this in fact create competitive advantage? And if it did for Avery Dennison, is it sustainable? And
Right.
my takeaway on this article was this article didn't even attempt to answer. And it's not a slam on the article. I think this is a very difficult question, but this article didn't even really address it. And so if I look at all this, I think at your CI, I think you should be taking lessons from this article. I think that those are some really smart things that you can do, but
Mhm.
you need to be definitive on that first question. Are you going to create competitive advantage? And I look at, I don't think there's anything wrong with taking an investment that only generates short-term advantage if you can generate ROI over that short-term period, but you need to go in eyes wide open about what you're actually doing with it. And so
Mhm.
I think it's just this really interesting sort of landscape that we're in right now.
Yeah, we're just starting to see the proof points right now. And I think it's still very much up in the air on how we're going to fully take advantage of the productivity that we gain from AI, whether it's the 5% that Asamoglu says, or this case study seems to reflect right now, or whether it's closer to the 50% that um, that Dario Amode thinks that we're going to have at the entry level. We have to use that productivity for something as well. I don't think simply reducing cost to as much as possible is a winning strategy in and of itself, no matter what business you're in.
Yeah, well, I do think that my last takeaway is that there's this old axiom when it comes to technology, and that is that the first wave of technology is always about automating or improving the way things presently work, and the
Hmm.
next phase is to reimagine how it works. And
Right.
I think what is absent from all of this, and again, not a slam, I think it's just where we're at, but what is absent from almost all of this is that reimagining process. And I think
Mhm.
we have to go through this stage to before we even are sort of freed to start that reimagining process. So it's going to be interesting.